Please welcome the Health and Wellbeing panel and its moderator, the Executive Director of Got Your Six, Bill Rausch.
All right. Good morning. After a little bit of a delayed entry, I'm happy to report, although we will not be talking about medicinal marijuana, we are going to have a lot of fun on the Health and Wellbeing panel. And so before we begin, again, my name is Bill Rausch. I'm an Iraq War veteran, Executive Director of Got Your Six. I have a remarkable, diverse, powerful group of executives and senior leaders in fields from research, philanthropy, nonprofit support, healthcare support, and we're going to have a tremendous conversation. Now, before we get started, I want to provide everyone some context for the first of 3 task force panels today, because what makes today unique is that each task force panel isn't simply a panel that we've put together with a few prep calls. Believe it or not, some of us have been working on this for 6 months. In conjunction and with the leadership of the Bush Institute. And so before we get started, one of the things we'd like to do is for those individuals who participated in the Health and Wellbeing Task Force, could you please raise your hand so everyone can recognize you? So please raise your hand in the audience. Let's give everyone a round of applause before we get started. And so health and well-being, what does that mean? And many of the individuals who raised their hands, certainly everyone on this panel, have been spending a lot of time talking about that. And yesterday, we had a culminating event where we really broke down not only what does it mean, but what is the vision for achieving health and well-being? What are the strategic objectives? And we want to give a report out of that before we start to talk a little bit more in detail of what that means to us. And when we think about health and well-being, you know, the men and women, for those of us who've been fighting our nation's wars for over 15 years now, we've come home to challenges but also opportunities as it relates to physical, mental health, invisible and visible wounds, lack of purpose, employment, education, a whole host of challenges and, again, opportunities. And what we've realized is health and well-being really encompasses all of that. And not just for the veteran, but for the military member who's still serving, their families, and caregivers. Although for the purposes of today's panel, we will focus on the veteran. And so for us, the vision that we came up with was to truly empower our community, those components I just mentioned, to thrive. That's really what we're talking about. And that North Star in terms of thriving, we think about in 4 different areas: physical health, mental, emotional health, communities and relationships, as well as purpose and identity. And the strategic objectives, again, the report out of yesterday's very robust meeting that may have been a little bit less tense with that medicinal marijuana, focused on elevating health and well-being, which we'll talk about in a minute, helping or modernizing government, VA specifically, we heard the Secretary talk about that, addressing knowledge gaps across sectors, and then really improving integration, not just within those areas serving our community, but the broader community. And so we have a tremendous group of panelists today, and we're going to jump right in. And I'm not going to give you their bios because they're too long, they're too prestigious, and you need to read the program. So with that, I'm going to ask Spencer to kick things off. And I'm going to ask you to kick things off in the sense of, you know, we talk about elevating health and well-being, but we also talk about integrating it with education and employment. You know, as the executive director, actually the president of the mission continues, what does that truly mean, not only for the organization, but for the community?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I'm encouraged by the conversation that hopefully you're hearing, and the conversations that we've been in over the course of the last few days, that is doing just that. That is elevating health and well-being to the same level as employment and as education, as an outcome or an aspiration for what we're doing with veterans. And, you know, alongside it becoming, on par with employment and education, it is becoming something that can be broken down to its elemental pieces and parts. Just like employment can be broken down into, are there, adequate jobs out there? Are there access to networks that, help veterans get into jobs? Are veterans able to translate the skills that they had in the military into language that is consumable by companies? Health and well-being can be broken down into elemental parts as well. And, each of those parts, different networks of organizations like ours can contribute to some of those parts, but what it becomes is an ecosystem where an organization like the Mission Continues, where we spend all of our time helping veterans reconnect to their sense of purpose by rolling up their sleeves and being part of solutions to real problems in their communities and their neighborhoods. That is one way of restoring or putting veterans on a path to an outcome, health and well-being. That's one way, but we can stitch together with clinical service providers who do it in another way, or we can stitch together with organizations who might be restoring physical health, or we can stitch together with organizations and programs that are restoring emotional health, and together, as an ecosystem, we're going after this new shared goal of, allowing and enabling veterans to thrive and establishing health and well-being as an outcome that's on par with employment and education.
Right, and it's brilliant, Spencer, because as you talk about that, and you alluded to the restoring of function and all the other components, it really, I think, starts to take shape of this is a really complex environment. And there's probably not just one way to go through it, which I think we're going to come back to you and ask you about in a second. But Jack, I want to get to you. Home base. You are extremely focused, extremely capable in restoring that function. And I'm curious, as it relates to what Spencer was saying, where have you seen folks succeed and where have you seen folks fail after they've gone through your program and you address, again, what you are spectacularly good at to restoring that function and putting that person on a path to true health and well-being, as we've talked about. Where have you seen folks succeed after they've left your program? Where have they perhaps not succeeded, especially when it comes to public-private partnerships and broader partnerships across different areas?
So first of all, as we all know, it takes a nation to build an army. It also takes a nation to welcome that army home and provide care and support when they return. No single program will solve this. And as we learned earlier today from Secretary Shulkin, some of the challenges the VA faces, they can't take this on by themselves. It takes the 99% that don't serve to lend their support to this issue through the public-private partnerships. When we see the best outcomes for veterans that come through home base, these are folks that get the clinical mitigation that they need. They get that stuck point fixed. They're given the skills to succeed in life, and then they're connected to something bigger. They have meaningful employment. They get back into college. They get connected with community-based programs, peer-to-peer programs that extend the longevity of that, and then set the conditions for success. So basically, programs like Home Base, our Warrior Care Network, clinical providers, we set the conditions for success. Then you have programs that connect folks to jobs, and community-based peer support programs, they guarantee that successful life. So one goes hand in glove with the other for the long-term success for the veteran, and that's really what it's all about. And when we look at our current situation, we have a national shortage of healthcare providers, so the VA can't cover that. It's all hands on deck. A really, really smart doctor at MGH once told me, when it comes to mental health and brain injuries, we're currently operating at a national level, on an AM radio level in a digital medical world. We need to change that, and so that's going to require all the AMCs across the country, academic medical centers, working with the VA, Department of Defense, as well as Big Pharma, to develop new drugs, improved drugs in technology, diagnostic equipment, because there's been no change in this area in 60 years. So we have outdated systems. We're working off an AM radio, and we don't really we haven't nailed down what that model for delivery of care is. But what is true is once they get that mitigation, they've got to be reconnected back to the community, back to their peers, and all those programs are invaluable to that long-term success.
Yeah. Thank you, Jack. And you know, it's funny, we just heard a panel talking about sort of post 9/11 veterans being younger, but you know, we just referenced an AM radio. So that just shows the diversity, obviously, the post 9/11 generation as well.
What's an AM radio?
Right, what's an AM radio? The millennials can Google it. So, you know, this is interesting because, you know, I'm almost hearing an evolution, perhaps of not what we know, but what's been built to really serve this broad sense of health and well-being that includes education and employment. And Harriet, given your executive leadership role at USAA, and I think just as importantly, the relationship you have with other funders outside the military community, what have you seen from a funding perspective as it relates to funders' understanding of health and well-being, and where do you think we can help educate and inform those funders so they truly understand what Spencer and Jack and others are talking about?
Absolutely, and thank you very much. And first I have to say, on behalf of USAA, our 30,000 plus employees and our CEO, it's an absolute honor to be here today. And everything we do is focused on supporting the military community, active duty, veterans, their families, military spouses, caregivers. And I will tell you that in most of these opportunities that I have the opportunity to represent USAA and our corporate philanthropy, I know that we are in the minority for what my peer group of corporate funders, Fortune 500 companies, understand about this very special demographic in our country, the military community. So I would imagine that most of the individuals in the audience today have a fundamental understanding of what you're talking about. And so with regards to the work that the task force has done so far, to break down the components of health and well-being into the 4 components you talked about, the layman corporate funder does not have that understanding that we are now developing with regards on how we help the military. And I believe when you talk about education, Bill, and the rest of the folks in the audience, once they understand how a corporate program that's already in place today can help with physical and mental well-being, can help with community and relationship, purpose and identity. It's not a new program that has to be started. It is a program that has deliberately and purposefully directed some of the funding to the military community. That's the long and the short of it. It can be that easy and that complex. So the 3 things that I would say, a corporate peer, and let me tell you the universe that is available that's untapped today. 1.4 million nonprofits registered in the nation today. 335 billion philanthropic dollars invested in the nation today. And a small component of that bill goes to this very deliberate and purposeful military community issue. Corporate funders need to understand that the military is an asset to be tapped into and leveraged for the many things that we've heard this morning, not a problem to solve and take care of. Secondarily, purposefully direct some of your funding, even if 10% of that budget, to take care of the military. And then lastly, once you've cracked the code, share your story and your success to help your corporate peer group do the exact same. Because I know that I'm predispositioned because I'm USAA for all of my entire life, but I believe our nation has the accountability, and I've heard you say that more than once, to take care of this demographic who has made the choice to serve and take care of us.
That's tremendous, Harriet. It reminded me of what the president said earlier, which is when we talk about bridging the divide, it's not just the individuals as we think of a returning service member and perhaps a civilian employer or a civilian in the community, but it's also within philanthropy, and that health and well-being and that education and employment, these are components that every American really is focused on to have that fulfilling and meaningful life that we all strive for. And Harriet asked me earlier to force participation, and I know some people raised their hands earlier, but we're going to do it again. So this time we're going to ask you to raise your hand. If you have a connection to the military community, could you please raise your hand? If you feel connected to it, and I know some people don't want to participate, but please be honest. So the majority of the room. So what we're doing is we're having conversations. Some people would say preaching to the choir, but we'll say we're talking to the choir. And I only mention that because we're going to have some action items and some homework for folks. So this is not only a fun panel, but this is a panel that's going to force you to do some work later today. And to inform what we're going to ask you to do, we're going to turn to our researcher on the panel, Terri. And Terri is a senior behavioral scientist at RAND. She's also one of the co-chairs for the task force with myself, along with J.J. Pinter with Team Red, White, and Blue. What are we missing in this conversation? I mean, it seems dynamic, it seems spot on, but from a research perspective, what are we not thinking about, or what should we add to the conversation to validate it in terms of the amazing work you've been doing over the years?
Well, thank you, Bill, and that's a great question. I have had the privilege and humbling responsibility to study the issues that affect our veterans, their spouses, their families, and their caregivers now for over a decade, and we've learned so much about their needs. We've also been able to track the progress that's been made in our ability to identify, recognize, treat, and manage some of the visible and invisible wounds that they face. But as we've also looked to the interventions and the programs that have been really supported across the government and non-governmental sector to support those with particular concerns or wanting to re-engage in their communities, we've seen diverse perspectives. We've seen a number of different organizations focused on different parts of this kind of outcome focused of Thrive. How do we help veterans, their families, and their caregivers thrive? And so while the community can be diverse, what we've also recognized is that they often share a common purpose. They face similar barriers, but they also have ideas about common solutions. And so the opportunity to come together as an entire group of individuals and organizations across the public, private sector, government, non-government, to really focus on a shared set of outcomes, to define what we mean by health and well-being for our veterans and their families and caregivers, but then to measure it, to actually understand how you assess whether or not you're moving the needle. Are you improving the outcomes and opportunities for the community that you're trying to affect? And how do we hold each other accountable? And that's why I think it's really important in a day like today and the work that we've been doing with the task force and the organizations that are participating to help us all understand that we want the same things, but we also have to define what are the outcomes, how do we measure them, and how do we actually hold ourselves accountable to work together towards those goals.
And now that we've just entirely gone through the first iteration, I think everybody should absolutely tweet something and then #StandTo, so don't forget about that, because we also, we collaborate, but we also are competitive, so we want to make sure that we're driving the most social traffic out of all the other great panels. But to that point, Spencer, I want to get back to something that we were talking about earlier, which is, what does success look like? And we have a diverse group of panelists up here. Some of us have served in the military, others are serving in many other ways. But what does success look like? What is that individual path to success? Or are there a multitude? And if there are a multitude, I'm not going to ask you to fully quantify it. Terri might do that. But I mean, how big is this idea of how many paths to success are there?
So there's probably just as many answers to that question. There's one answer to that question is that success is that you walk up to 20+ million Americans, veterans, and their families and their caregivers, and ask the question, do you feel like you have the opportunity to thrive in this country? And the answer is yes. That's success. Another version of success is that you go up to the thousands of organizations who claim to serve veterans and their families and military families, and you ask, do you feel like you're maximizing your contribution to veterans thriving? And those organizations say yes. And they say yes not only because of what we're doing individually, but what we are, the ecosystem that we're part of, and the partnerships that we have with other organizations who are maximizing their contribution. You know, I went on the first. I'm super interested with the possibility that we could have millions of veterans and their families and their caregivers who are saying, yes, we're thriving. I'm motivated by that concept. And, you know, on the backside of a very key and, you know, kind of monumental operation for the Mission Continues, we were just down in Atlanta, on the west side of Atlanta, with a bunch of veterans who had flown in from all across the country, who volunteered alongside hundreds of community members on the west side of Atlanta over a targeted and intense 7-day period where, again, they rolled up their sleeves and contributed vastly to an ongoing initiative on the west side of Atlanta to revitalize a neighborhood that was struggling to preserve its heritage and capture the potential that it has. You know, here are a bunch of veterans who are getting dirty together, that are sharing a mission, that are sharing space. You know, they were in the dorms, the vacated dorms at Georgia Tech. You heard a lot of, you know, speech, you know, and language that you would have heard when you were in the military. You had, you know, tough missions. You had community members and kids who were out on the, you know, out at these project sites and seeing what veterans are capable of. You had veterans who were connecting to each other, you know, socially and emotionally, and you look at an environment like that and you are reminded of the concept of thriving, and you see one way that that veterans can thrive. And you know, I'm encouraged by the fact that there are other ways. Those veterans who were with us in Atlanta can leave, and then they can go do a run with Team Red, White, and Blue, or they can go and, you know, access tremendous emerging care at any one of the VA facilities or any of the non-VA facilities that are out there. I'm super excited about the fact that that is an achievable goal, right, or it's an achievable outcome, that we can have 20+ million veterans saying that they're thriving, and so are their families, and so are their caregivers.
That's amazing, Spencer. And the Atlanta trip was Operation Surge, was it not?
West Side Surge.
West Side Surge. For those of us who have an affinity to the Surge, including the president, we appreciate the name of the operation, Operation Surge in Atlanta. And I'll tell you what inspires me, and it also reminds me of the simple fact that members of our community are tremendous citizens. We're civic assets. We are leaders. We do volunteer more. We vote more. We give more. And a lot of us don't know that. We think as we transition that perhaps we do have some of those challenges, and we need to remind ourselves often that we have not only an opportunity to serve, but, you know, an obligation to continue our service, which is extremely fulfilling. And I think the Operation West Side Surge is a great example of that. And so, Jack, back to you. I'm giving you the tough questions, Jack, but you know, you're the general, so you can handle the tough questions. Where are the gaps? You know, we're talking about, you know, solutions. We're talking about the many paths to health and well-being. We're talking about community and the holistic approach. The work you have done over the years, not only in Boston, but across the network, as you mentioned earlier, is vast. Where have you seen some of the gaps that we need to think about in terms of addressing those issues so we can continue to move forward to best serve our community?
So I think one of the areas that really needs some work when we talk about these public-private partnerships is synchronizing these efforts. Yeah. Spence talked about the 45,000 veteran service organizations and the 1.2 million nonprofits. A challenge we have is synchronizing that effort so that the veterans can have a clear navigation to get to them, number one, and then they work together in a synchronized manner. Right. And so recently, through the Warrior Wellness Alliance with the Bush Institute, we brought together groups from all of these various organizations to try and begin that synchronization process. A few years ago, with the Wounded Warrior Project, we brought 4 academic centers together to create a network of care, which, if anybody had been in the room the first day, the thought of everybody sharing data, working in a very seamless environment was questionable, but it worked. It's now expanded. We've now got the Marcus Foundation building traumatic brain injury centers across the country. We've got the Cohen Veteran Network. And all of us have pledged and agreed to work, bilateral referrals, share data, and frankly, work together. And so that's one step in the equation. The next step will be, how are we then connected to the peer-to-peer organizations and the community-based organizations so we can get that seamless transition. And we can't forget the VA. The VA is now a partner with us. We do bilateral referrals, which 4 years ago, they wouldn't talk to us.
Right.
They now, through their leadership, not only have a VA representative at each clinic that will help facilitate records, but they do referrals to us, and then they take folks and refer them back into the VA system in a very kit-glove manner, which is effective. So moving forward, we've got to, work on the synchronization, have seamless transitions between these organizations, and then we've got to leverage the vast resources of the private sector. And I really go back to that piece with science and technology, pharma, to develop better tools for us to use, fund research, because again, we're still working with that AM radio. We need to have better models of care and treatments. So I think that those are the gaps, but there's also great solutions that are available, and we're really on our way.
We are. I'm glad that when we ask about gaps, we have the opportunity to talk about our successes, because again, this is an informed room of folks, but the work you're doing with your network, and you mentioned Cohen and Marcus, and the Secretary's willingness to integrate, and the community. I mean, there truly is, I think, what I'm hearing is an opportunity, and timing has a lot to do with it. But then you also mention, the for-profit sector being involved. And Harriet, I want to come back to you because, ultimately, you shared earlier how many nonprofits there are, not in our community, but across the country. You highlighted the fact that when we are considering engaging partners to think more broadly than just military, veteran, family, or caregiver issues, give us a tip on how do we engage those large philanthropic organizations who perhaps don't know our community, but are very focused on the exact same issues that we're focused on. Because again, I can't emphasize it enough from my own personal experience, the challenges I had to overcome, whether it was experiencing trauma or transition and so on, although unique because of my military service, they had many similarities to other folks. So how do we engage those other philanthropists who are focused on health and well-being, education, employment, but just not within the military community?
So the first step I think would be is, again, the education, and the education beyond the bottom line fund me request. So one thing that I've said, and what I see is that in these gatherings, and I love these gatherings, but many times it's the choir. And so how do we extend an invitation for education, not for funding requests, but for education, just so that folks truly understand that there are correlating issues, correlating opportunities that just expand your net to ensure and demand that the organizations you support today are including the military and veteran community. So one thing that I've asked everybody to do in my circle is take stock of your personal and professional network. And if your personal and professional network looks like you, talks like you, has your same experience, it's limiting that connectivity and connection with the broader community. And so this room could actually be doubled with me having somebody with me and accountability to bring that person who's uninitiated. And I'll tell you one thing that we did at USAA, and this is not a USAA commercial, though if there are any members in the room, thank you. We love taking care of you. Just had to say that. Thank you for your membership. Members, yes. And so one thing that we did at USAA is we hosted an event in San Antonio, Military City, USA, and invited corporate partners that we knew were not focused on the military community. We took them to Fort Sam for a tour, and most of them had never been on a military installation. We explained that supporting the military community was beyond hiring a vet, and post that event, I heard from a significant number of those corporate funders that said they hadn't funded before and they were going to direct funding to the military. And if they were hiring and engaged in taking care of vets through careers, they were going to expand their reach and provide corporate funding in the other areas like we're talking. So I know that that might sound simplistic, but really just engaging outside of your comfort zone and your regular space to help others have a cultural competency in this space that is military and veteran community. Does that make sense?
I love it. I think, and for context, I mean, it goes more than just, you know, as an Army guy, befriending a Navy individual, as difficult as that is, right? Be Navy. It really is, to your point, getting us out of our comfort zones, because you can't bridge a gap if you're not going to try to cross the ravine, right? And I think that's very powerful, and not only applies to philanthropy, but all the work. Now, you did mention one thing I want to highlight before we move to Terri, which is Military Town USA in San Antonio. For those of you who don't know, I live in Alexandria, Virginia, and I love my community, which was ranked by militarytimes.com as the #1 mid-sized city for veterans. So maybe San Antonio and Alexandria should do something together. My shameless plug for Alexandria. So Terri, so I want to get back to data, and I also want to talk about something that Spencer everyone's brought up, but there's this theme here of not only reaching out to individuals outside the military community. There's not only a theme about, well, our issues are similar, although unique, similar to individuals outside of our community. Talk to me about the support for members of our community, military veterans, families, as well as caregivers. Talk to me about it in a sense of the opportunity, the ROI for that, the return on investment, as opposed to this idea of charity, saying, listen, we need to help these poor individuals, whether it's, and somebody mentioned it earlier, not a handout, but a hand up. Talk to us a little bit about the data and the research out there that validates that we are not only the individuals who should be supported because of our nation's desire to recognize the service that we've certainly given to our country, but talk about it in the sense that the opportunity for us to continue to serve and lead the country and communities, whether it's in Atlanta or elsewhere, to solve their problems. Can you talk a little bit about the data that's out there and validate what I'm saying so convincingly?
I will try. But I also have to reflect on, as I mentioned, having studied these issues for a number of years and really beginning that work right after September 11th, the progress that we have made and how the dialogue has changed. And while we were focused on federal systems of care to really address the issues of invisible wounds of war, the visible injuries of amputations and burns, we've come so far to change the dialogue to now embrace a more holistic concept. But also we've seen those federal systems of care open up and embrace and want to engage with others to really be able to deliver on the outcomes for veterans and their families and caregivers. I mean, to understand how these networks have evolved with funding from the philanthropic sector, what started as a disparate set of academic medical organizations funded to implement programs in their communities under Welcome Back Veterans has now grown to the Warrior Care Network. Now they're partnering under the Warrior Wellness Alliance. It's just amazing. We do know that investing in providing high quality treatment for the health-related conditions that many of our veterans will experience does pay off. It saves society. It increases their quality of life. It decreases the costs associated with lost productivity. So there is a return on investment in making sure that we can deliver high-quality services, particularly for post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. What we don't have is a lot of data on the ROI for the efforts that we're aiming at in the well-being space. We're beginning to gather some of that information and data and really understand the power and the impact of non-traditional interventions, particularly as we think about expanding our toolbox to include those things that may fall in the complementary and alternative medicine realm. What is the role of adaptive sports? What is the role of mindfulness and acupuncture? We're starting to see some of that data really demonstrate that they can be efficacious and effective in attending to the needs of our veterans. But we need to commit to continuing to gather more. Research can help us understand needs. It can help us target our interventions and our policies. But most importantly, it can improve lives by understanding where we're having value and where we're able to ensure that we're delivering high quality. So while we have some data, Bill, we really need to make sure that we're collecting even more on how all these efforts are changing the lives of veterans.
No, thank you. And that's one of the biggest challenges because, again, as we said at the onset, this idea of health and well-being is so broad. And there's so much more work to be done, notwithstanding the amazing work that we've been engaged with. So in our closing minutes, I'm going to ask to come down the panel before we give some thanks and ask you to either share something that we haven't touched on. And again, as a reminder to folks, many of us have been engaged with this conversation and this work for 6 months and numerous calls. And yesterday I had a large convening here with 40+ organizations to really build consensus around some of these ideas, which is not easy to do. So in closing, either provide something we haven't discussed that is really relevant and important, or, but we have to be quick, give everyone a homework assignment, because I really like when we do that, especially when I'm the one giving the homework assignment.
And I get to go first?
You get to go first, Terri, and then we'll come down the line.
So while I should say fund research, I will say I think it's important that we get out of our comfort zones and get to know other individuals in your communities who may have a different perspective, who may have a different approach. So as we all are working together in this sector, I think we should open ourselves up to new conversations and new relationships. So I would encourage you all to meet somebody new today, someone who perhaps delivers a different types of service. If you're in the education sector, meet somebody in the well-being sector. If you're in the employment sector, talk to some of those folks in the education sector. But even within your own sectors, get to know how other organizations are approaching it so that you can find those common grounds to focus on the outcomes we care about.
So I refuse to give homework because we're on summer vacation now. But I will say, in closing, I think our 3 veteran speakers from this morning are what fire me up to date, or so far in this conference, because I think they embody this notion of thriving. And what fires me up is that while they were up here speaking about kind of the respective pillars, whether it was health and well-being or employment or education, they also embodied this notion of whole health and how there are many pathways to thriving. So while Fontaine, was the chapter head of Student Veterans of America and had, key parts in her pathway that led to her education and her her GI Bill benefits and all of that component. She's also a member of the Houston Service Platoon and other pieces that led to her thriving. And while Mike and his spouse and his family are dealing with the scars of service and the invisible wounds that they all deal with together, he's also banging the door down to have a service platoon come to Fort Bragg. And while Flo is establishing pathways to employment through Boeing and other companies like Boeing, he's on the ground in Southeast DC at service projects, trying to strengthen the community. There are lots of different pathways. Many of the organizations and individuals in this room have pieces and parts and contributions to those pathways, and this room has to work together to make sure we've got 20+ million stories like the 3 we heard this morning.
Thank you, Spencer. Harriet, could we do it in 60 seconds or less? Spencer took up a lot of time on his summer vacation.
So I wanted to have two, but I'll only take one. And so the words matter. I know that this is going to sound so basic, but when we talk about educating beyond our group, beyond the choir, the words matter. So saying specifically active duty, Guard and Reserve, veteran, caregiver, families of the fallen, when I talk with my corporate partners, their understanding is veteran and what they see on TV. How do we use the words to educate, raise awareness, and increase the support so that our communities are unified?
Brilliant. Thank you, Harriet. Jack?
So as someone who's lost more soldiers to suicide than I did in multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, this is obviously something hugely personal to me. And so what I'd ask people to do is if they know a veteran that's been home for a while, that's really not 100% back to where they were, get them connected to something. You know, it doesn't matter what. If it's a peer-based program, whether it's clinical care, whether it's a community program, any one of those things is a great start. And then as things build up and they get more traction and they get more comfortable, the water rises to its level, they'll find the care they need, they'll feel more comfortable with it, but get them connected, because we can't afford to lose 22 a day. We can't just keep throwing that number around without actually taking action. And action is as simple as intervening and getting them connected to another veteran organization of some kind so that they have peers and friends that can help them through the rough spots. So I'd say help guys and gals get connected.
Thank you, Jack. And so you have your marching orders, even if Spencer gave you a pass. I mean, there's plenty of work to continue, plenty of work that's been done, but the opportunity is certainly now. And so in closing, on behalf of the Health and Wellbeing Task Force, we want to thank all of the participants, those who have been involved for 6 months, those who have been involved for 6 weeks. We want to thank all of you. We want to give special thanks to the Bush Institute. Your leadership has been tremendous, not only with Colonel Miguel Howe, but also the highest ranking individual, Corporal Jeff Cleland. Wanted to get that in there as well. And ultimately want to thank President and Mrs. Bush. And in closing, people forget something, and it amazes me, because I'm truly inspired by the President's remarks and how he is part of our community. And that's what I want to close with, because President Bush is a veteran. He is a member of our community, and we are very fortunate to have him not only convene us today to move the discussion to collaborative action, but his continued leadership on issues ranging from military and veterans across the spectrum. So with that, thank you very much for being part of the conversation. Thank you, panelists. If we could give them a round of applause, and have a great day. Thank you. Thanks, guys.